Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you might happen to be watching this. If you're following along with this week by week, you might have noticed that I didn't put one up last week, lesson up last week, and that's because I was celebrating my 39th anniversary in the mountains of North Georgia, fly fishing for trout. It was a wonderful time, but now it's time for us to get back to the study of the New Testament. We only have a few weeks left. Today, we'll be dealing with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, called often the Johannine epistles, after the author of the Gospel of John. Remember, of course, that the author of the Gospel of John is not stated in the text, and so we don't know for sure who that was. And the author of these epistles is not stated in the text, except for in 3rd John, he calls himself the elder. And so we can't be absolutely sure about who wrote these, but there are certain clues that tend to make us think that the same person who wrote the Gospel of John also wrote these epistles. So let's look at them together. The 2nd and 3rd are very small books, just almost cover letters in some way. So virtually everyone agrees that the book of 1st John is essentially about 3 tests of your faith. You believe that Christ has come in the flesh, and that affects the way that you obey the law, and it affects the way that you treat other people. If you hold on to those sort of 3 things, you can get a sense for what the book of 1st John is about. And here, of course, is a person who's yawning, and so we think of first yawn, and he has a barometer. And the barometer is to tell us about whether or not we are really a member of God's kingdom. And he's checking out this, it's a sort of fellowship barometer, and it tells the difference between true and false fellowship. Fellowship with God, fellowship with other believers. The writer of the Gospel of John in this letter follows the examples of Paul, and he confronts heresy. There's some very specific heresies that we'll talk about later that existed during John's day and that exist during our day that he exposes, and he wants them to understand that people who are true followers of Christ are people who have been forgiven and who are walking in the light. And those who truly have love and fellowship for one another. This summarizes the 5 chapters of John's first epistle. The second epistle, of course, we have 2 yawns there, and they are bolting the door. Even though they're yawning and they're about asleep, they're bolting the door. And that's sort of a key word to 2nd John. It's unwise to grow so tired that you become spiritually asleep to danger. There was some danger in the church, and 2nd John points that out. And he says, be careful about those people who would want to come in and create heresy in the church. And that those members of the church ought to be wise enough to know the difference between the creation of heresy or the pushing of heresy and the holding on to the truth that God gives us. And so John in 2nd John reminds us that he reminds those church members to whom he's writing, those Christians to whom he's writing, that deceivers are traveling around and they are staying with other people, and that Christians should not welcome them. They should not take them into their house lest they share in the wicked work of a false teacher. And so in our day, sometimes people have argued that to invite a person like a Jehovah's Witness into your house, or a Mormon, or a person of the Church of the Latter-day Saints into your house, or something like that, someone who is not a member of the Christian church, to invite them into your house is to violate what John says. But that's not what John is saying. John is saying don't invite them into your house and let them stay there. We know that there were people who went around as missionaries staying with other Christians. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But the Didache, a book that means the teaching, was written about 100 A.D. or 125, and it was very well known, and some argued that it ought to be canonized. It says that if a person comes and stays with you for more than, I believe it's 3 or 4 days, and doesn't offer to help pay for his food and his lodging, then you ought to put him out because he's a false teacher. The point is that there are these people that are going around just trying to do anything they can to make a way for themselves without having to work. And 2 John is warning us to be careful, not just because they're going to stay and take advantage of you, but more importantly because they're going to create real problems in the church. This is the third yawn. And the third yawn, we now have an open door. And this open door reminds us that there are some people that need to be put out of the church. Gaius is a person to whom this book, this letter, 3 John, is written. And he has acted hospitably, and there's a person in the church that is creating some problems. His name is Diotrephes. And Diotrephes, the King James says, loves to have the preeminence. That is, he wants to be the one who really is in charge. And so Diotrephes is said by John, don't put up with him. Don't follow in the steps of Diotrephes. John's letter to Gaius is indirectly warning Diotrephes that anyone who does what is evil, anyone who desires to have the preeminence, anyone who does what Diotrephes is doing has some problems and may be put out of the church. So that in very big strokes is a picture of the Johannine epistles. So let's look a little more carefully at some of the questions that we wonder about when we get to the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. First, we'll look at the authorship of the 3 epistles. We'll look in 2 different ways, both external evidence and internal evidence. External evidence, of course, is what other people have to say. What does the early church have to say about who wrote these books? What does the early church have to say about whether or not these were actually written by John? Internal evidence, which we'll get to next, is what's inside the book that makes us think that it was written by the same person who wrote the gospel. Early on, 1st Clement of Rome describes God's elect people as being perfected in love. And the Didache, again, from maybe as early as 90, but that might be late, probably 100 to 125, has something very similar in a parallel. And this is, even in the Didache, it's made more impressive by the fact that the text talks about the world passing away. And so we get a sense from that both of them knew about the epistle of 1 John, and they are echoing it, even though they don't mention it there. Then there's the epistle of Barnabas that comes from about 130 to 150, somewhere around in there. And this speaks of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, come in the flesh. And so remember that that's a critical theme in the very first part of 1 John. And we'll talk about why that's so critical in just a minute. Then there's Polycarp. Polycarp is very early, and Polycarp warns against deceiving false brothers in these terms, the terms that you see there. Everyone who does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is Antichrist. This is the first written source that we know of to specifically refer to a Johannine epistle. And he gets this from Papias, or Papias, depending upon how you want to say it. And Papias says that John himself wrote this first epistle of John. Now, we don't have Papias' writings. What we have are fragments of Papias, and we have Papias reconstructed from Eusebius, who's from the 4th century. And in Eusebius, Eusebius quotes Papias as saying that these epistles used testimonies from John. And so we can say that very early on we get this evidence that John himself is the author of the text. Here's a little more external evidence. Irenaeus is at least, he knows about the first and second epistle of John, and that they are identified with the son of Zebedee. And writing at about the same time as Irenaeus is Clement of Alexandria, who knows that he knows that there's more than one Johannine epistle, because he talks about the greater Johannine epistle, or the greater letter, the larger letter, indicating that there must have been a smaller letter. You don't say the longer letter if there's not a shorter one. And he also ascribes it to the Apostle John. Origen, who dates to about AD 250, first mentions all 3 epistles. And yet he's not quite willing to accept all 3 of them as having been written by John. He knows that they exist, but he questions the authenticity of 2nd and 3rd John. But Origen's student, Dionysius of Alexandria, insisted that John the Apostle wrote the 4th Gospel and wrote 1st John and 2nd and 3rd John, but not Revelation. So there's some questioning there about who's writing what. Let's look at the internal evidence. And really, all of these arguments internally, finally they turn on the relation of these epistles to the 4th Gospel. That is, can we say that the epistles of John are in essence written by the same person, or seem to be written by the same person as that one who wrote the Gospel of John? There are a variety of similarities. And there's similarity in syntax and similarity in simplicity. 1 John is probably the easiest book to read in Greek. At the end of first year Greek, I have my students read through the book of 1 John. In fact, 1 John is the very first book that I ever read in Greek, and I still remember sitting there reading through an entire book of the Bible in Greek and saying, these are the very words that were written by the apostle. What are the similarities that we see? Well, there's light and darkness, which we see in John. There's life and death, which we see in John. There's truth and falsehood, which we see in the gospel. There's love and hate. All of these are things that we see in the gospel. There's also differences, though. There are also differences. And so some have argued for different authors between the 3 epistles, and different authors among all 3 of them from the gospel writer. And they have argued that based on key doctrines and terms that are used differently, and that words and expressions that are not shared by the Gospel of John and 1 John. And so those who argue for a different author between the 2 usually appeal to this kind of phenomena that they just don't seem to be written by the same person. I'm not sure that that's a strong piece of evidence. In fact, I think that these differences seem to be overplayed, because many of the supposed differences that occur between the Gospel and 1 John these same differences are present within the gospel itself. And so John is a person who loves language and loves to use synonyms. Probably the most famous use of synonyms is when Peter and Jesus are speaking together at the end of the book. And Jesus says, "Do you love me?" And Peter answers, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And they use two different words, two different Greek words for love. A lot of exegetical hay has been made out of what I think is just John using two terms that in that case are synonymous. I don't think there's some exegetical point to be made by the two different uses of love. But the vocabularies of the gospel and of 1 John are more similar than Luke and Acts. And almost no one would deny that the author of Luke and Acts is the same person. Almost no one. And so, given the fact that these are similar, we can say, well, at the very least, there's that chance. The insistence upon a Johannine school. Some have argued that John, the gospel, was written by a particular person, and a school that followed him and his teaching actually wrote these letters. I don't think we need that. We don't need that kind of an insistence. I mean, it's possible that that existed, but I don't, and it's possible that they wrote the book, the letters, but I don't think that's the case. There are we passages, and some argue that the we passages indicate a school, that is more than one person. And yet, the we passages indicate something more than just a more than one person. They indicate eyewitness testimony. And so the writer may be thinking back to the time when he and others witnessed this incredible time when they were watching and seeing the very miracles of Jesus Christ. And so let's move on then past the internal evidence, or to a couple of other quick pieces of internal evidence. In 2nd and 3rd John, the author refers to himself as the elder. This doesn't need to be taken as a different person from the apostle, particularly since John is in all likelihood the oldest of the apostles, and he is probably the last one to be living. So to call himself the elder is not at all to be taken as anything different. So let's think then about provenance. Where was the gospel written from? Whether one thinks in terms of the apostle writing or whether one thinks in terms of the Johannine school, the most likely place from which the book is written is in Ephesus. And so we can think for ourselves today that the book that we have in our hands, probably all of them, were written in Ephesus. Let's then think about the date. The date of the book, the date of the letters, is entirely bound up with the date of the fourth gospel and their relationship to it. So it was written in the early 90s, probably because the Gospel of John is by most seen to be the latest of the Gospels written. So it may have been written as late as 90. And so we know that these books were written after the fourth gospel. And so that's what we have. We have with us this belief that John wrote his gospel, or someone wrote the Gospel of John. Then that same person wrote these 3 letters. To where did the book go? We don't know for certain, but we can say that probably churches in the same region as Ephesus. That is, we don't know that for certain because 1 John is silent on this matter. He doesn't say, I'm writing to the church at Ephesus. And so it may have been a circular letter, a letter that was written for the specific purpose of being going around to a variety of different churches. 2 John is sent to a local congregation, and the congregation is spoken of as the lady chosen by God, or the elect lady in the King James. This is some particular church. And 2 John is almost a sort of cover letter that goes along with 1 John, saying that 1 John tells them about what the heresies are, and 2 John says, when you find these heresies, get those people out of the church. Don't let them continue on with what they are doing. Well, what's the purpose of these books? What is it that we can say what reason can we say that these books were written? That's really what we want to know for certain. Why were these books written? Why did God inspire John to write these 3 particular epistles? Why did he inspire us to know about these books? Well, there are 3 things that I'll tell you about that John specifically wants to warn us against in the book of 1 John. And there are overlaps between them. The first is proto-Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism as a fully developed heresy didn't exist at the time, but there was a sort of a philosophical potpourri that was anchored in Neoplatonism, and essentially what the primary idea was that there's a very firm line between that which is physical and that which is spiritual. And so that which is spiritual is good, and that which is physical is evil. Therefore, anything that we can touch or feel is not spiritual, and it will never be good. We will only be good when we are rid of our bodies. That's why this idea of a bodily resurrection was so shocking to the people who heard about it, particularly the Greeks. Because for Plato, for example, you remember from reading virtually any of Plato's works, but particularly his longer works, you remember that for Plato, we want to be rid of this body. This body sort of keeps us back. And so in their mind, these Gnostics, these proto-Platonists, thought there's this very firm line between the spiritual and the physical. And you can see the kind of issue that brings up. It brings up the question of, well then, how is it possible that God himself became flesh? If the flesh is of necessity evil, how is it that God could become flesh? Because that would mean God becoming evil. And so the proto-Gnostics said, and they had a variety of ways of getting around it, but in essence they said that God really didn't come in the flesh. That was the first heresy, that proto-Gnosticism. The second heresy was Docetism. Dokeo in Greek means to seem or to look like. And this is sort of a branch of Gnosticism, because some Gnostics would say that Christ was a spirit that came upon Jesus at his baptism, and it left him at his crucifixion. And so the man Jesus had the Christ spirit, but he wasn't God. God just came upon him. That was one way that the Gnostics dealt with the problem of Jesus becoming flesh. Another way, and this is the docetic way, and that they argued that Christ only seemed to have a body. He didn't really have a body. He looked like it and he walked around, but he didn't really have a body. And that's the reason that John begins the very first epistle by saying, that which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which we have handled with our hands concerning the word of life. John is saying to those who are listening to him, you can say what you want to about Jesus not being a real person, but I touched him. I saw him. I looked at him closely. I know that he really was here. John reminds us in the gospel about Jesus eating, about Jesus sleeping. John doesn't remind us about Jesus sleeping, but the synoptic gospels tell us about Jesus sleeping, tells us about Jesus needing rest. All of those things are things that are only needed by a person who is in the flesh. And so it's critically important to John that you not only say that God has come, but that you say that God has come in the flesh. And there's a story in Eusebius about John, and Eusebius reports it from Polycarp. John was in a bathhouse at some point in Ephesus, apparently, and he found out that Cerinthus was in it. Cerinthus was this arch heretic who said that Jesus hadn't really come in the flesh. And so John ran out of the bathhouse saying that God could at any time reach down and destroy this enemy of truth by crashing the bathhouse down, and John didn't want to be in there when he did it. So that's an example of the sort of things that we see in 1 John. 1 John is saying to us that because we know that God has come in the flesh, we can trust him to take care of us. And if we are unwilling to admit that God has come in the flesh, then we are not really members of traditional Christianity. What about 2 John? 2 John is about taking those enemies, the proto-Gnostics, the Docetists, and he is primarily to warn the congregation or the house church against admitting those traveling teachers who are espousing that kind of false teaching. 2 John is saying, if somebody comes in who says that Jesus did not come in the flesh, get rid of them. And it's the same sort of thing the church must do today. If someone comes in espousing a heresy, then it is the church's responsibility to say, you cannot teach or say those kinds of things here. It is against the Scripture, it is against God, and either you must admit that you were wrong or you must go somewhere else. That's what 2 John is about. Remember that 2 John says they went out from us because they were not of us. That's not talking about someone who goes to another church, leaves your church and goes to another one. It's not that. It's about that person who leaves the church because he or she has been warned about heresy and refuses to repent of it. Then, of course, there's the book of 3 John. And in 3 John, it's very interesting. In 2 John, no name is mentioned except for Jesus Christ. 3 John, though, mentions specific names. He mentions, first of all, that the book is written to Gaius, and he mentions that Diotrephes has a very serious problem. And it's probably not that Diotrephes is a heretic in some way. It's more likely that Diotrephes is a powerful and arrogant church leader, and that he will not accept correction even from John himself. And as a result of that, he's simply unwilling to listen to what the church leaders have to say. And so the letter says to Gaius, do not let him overpower you with his personality or with his personal force. Even though he loves to strut around and act like he's in charge, he shouldn't be doing that, and don't let him do that. I'd like for us to end with a quick focus on the adoption into the canon Origen mentions, as we've said, some of these epistles. Eusebius classifies 1 John as acknowledged, but 2nd and 3rd John as disputed, along with Jude. Eusebius himself, though, he appears to have accepted all three, even though he says that they have been taken out. And so, together, all these letters demonstrate the importance to re-articulate the gospel, and they emphasize the doctrine of assurance. And I'd like to leave you with a quotation from St. Augustine that will remind us of the love that John says we ought to have. John says, "Love all men, even your enemies, not because they're your brothers, but because they may become your brothers." It's a great line, and it's a great summation of the letters of John. It's not that we hate these people, it's that we love them and we want them to know the truth. So, I hope that this has been a blessing to you. Next week we'll be looking at one of my favorite books of the New Testament, Jude. A small book, but a book that has a lot of interesting things in it. And then, of course, the week after, we'll finish up with the book of Revelation. Thanks so much for watching Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. We are so glad to have you with us, and I will see you again next week. Thank you.